Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tynesha Boye Robinson, and I am the CEO of CapEQ, an impact investing and advisory firm. I'm joined by several of my partners at PolicyLink and members of the Civil Rights Audit Standards Committee, whom you'll be hearing from soon. On behalf of CapEQ, PolicyLink, and the committee, I am so thrilled to welcome you to the release of the Civil Rights Audit Standards. The Civil Rights Audit Standards are a groundbreaking tool that was developed through a collaborative process over 12 months. These action-oriented standards are pro-business and have clear performance criteria and robust implementation guidance. This is a huge milestone in our work, and we're so excited to be able to share these standards with all of you. We could not have gotten here without the support of our colleagues, partners, and funders. There's a big team with us, and we won't get to introduce everybody today, but we do want to thank all of you who supported and helped to shape our work to date. Now, during today's session, we will provide an overview of the standards and how they connect to other leading efforts, and preview how they should be implemented over time, including through a civil rights auditor training program. You will hear from a diverse set of stakeholders who were instrumental in shaping the standards. Today's webinar participants will include Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink and committee member Mahalet Getachew, and Civil Rights Attorney and lead drafter of the standards, Farhana Kara. You will also hear from committee members Roy Austin, who's the Vice President of Civil Rights and Deputy General Counsel at Meta, Evan Feeney, who is the Senior Director of Campaigns and Organizing at Color of Change, and is also serving as our Civil Rights Audit Committee Chair, Renee Manley, who is a Research Fellow at Harvard Law School Center for Labor and a Just Economy, who is also serving as the CRA Committee Vice Chair, and Tejal Patel, the Executive Director of SOC Investment Group. Now, before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping notes with you. We will have closed captioning available during the webinar, and a recording will be shared after the event. We are also recording this webinar and will share the recording and slides with all registrants via email after the event. Now, please note that the chat channel is closed for attendees, but we do invite you to submit your questions to us through the Q&A function at any time throughout the webinar. Attendees will not be able to see each other's questions about today's content and will not be named who submitted the questions to maintain the anonymity of those who submit those questions. If you ask a question to troubleshoot a technical issue, however, we may not be able to respond to you within the Q&A section, which might be seen by other attendees. We have so much to share today, so if we don't get to all the questions, we'll attempt to add as many as we can to our list of frequently asked questions on the website for the standards in the coming weeks. Given the number of attendees joining the webinar live, our capacity to provide technical support is limited. So if you experience any technical issues while on the Zoom platform, please consider just hopping out of the meeting and rejoining. If that does not resolve your issue, we hope that you'll at least be able to view or listen to the recording after the event. Now, I want to give a little bit of background on the civil rights audits overall. You see, civil rights audits have increasingly become a corporate best practice in recent years. Particularly following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, several corporations committed to conducting independent reviews on the potential bias and discriminatory risks of their policies, practices, philanthropy, products, and/or services. As important stakeholders, including employees and union groups, investors, civil rights groups, and regulators sought answers. These commitments followed the first civil rights audits conducted beginning in 2016 of Airbnb, and later than Facebook and Starbucks. Today, dozens of companies from Apple to State Street Advisors and Verizon have completed civil rights audits or have audits underway. Each audit has included recommendations for how companies can improve the experiences of staff, customers, or communities of color while meeting their business objective. Yet, despite the commitment to these audits, there was a lack of consistency in how the audits were conducted and their end result. This experience in turn began to call into question the credibility of many of these civil rights audits. In a study we conducted for the Ford Foundation, my colleagues and I at CapEQ heard from diverse stakeholders. We found that business executives, investors, unions, civil rights groups, and auditors were all in agreement on a key priority: the need for standards for civil rights audits. Civil Rights Audit Standards, they told us, would bring much needed clarity on what a civil rights audit should focus on and how to conduct an audit. That's what the Civil Rights Audit Standards do. I want you to hear from one of those business leaders, and I'm going to turn it over to Roy, who'll share a little bit more background about civil rights audits. Over to you, Roy.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate all the work that's been put into this. I appreciate all of you who are here listening today, and I appreciate the team that put together these audit standards. Really, truly amazing work. Look, there isn't a business that doesn't impact historically and systemically marginalized communities. Not a single business. And because of that, there isn't a business that should not have a civil rights audit completed audit. Look, the law requires, this isn't just a want to have or it's nice to have. The law requires that we treat people fairly regardless of their race, religion, national origin, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability, or any other of the numerous other protected characteristics in federal and state and local law. Now, I'm in this position as the Vice President of Civil Rights at Meta because of an amazing civil rights audit that was completed by Laura Murphy and Megan Kikesi. What they did ensured that we as a company were considering civil rights in the decisions that were being made. And look, since I've been here, we've made a difference, right? We've made a difference because Laura Murphy and Megan Kikesi told the company over 100 different things that the company should be doing to ensure that it was on the right side of civil rights. And we as a team are able to hold the company accountable and make sure that these things are being considered and in most cases, the vast majority of cases, getting done. Part of our work was training over 50,000 Meta employees on civil rights. That had now not been done at Meta prior to this. We are a line of communication for stakeholders across the country who care about civil rights. And we are their first line of communication many times. And then we can express their thoughts, their concerns, their needs, their wants to the company at a very high level. We are also just in the room. As things move fast, we are in the room to make sure that everyone, as they're making their decisions, are considering civil rights issues. That is incredibly important. For my company, we created 5 pillars. Those pillars are technology, voting and civic engagement, hate crimes and hate speech, policy, product. And different companies are going to be different pillars where civil rights are most significant, most need to be looked at. But again, there isn't a company in this country, there isn't a company in the world that shouldn't be concerned at how it's treating historically and systemically marginalized communities. Now, having standards, and that's what this conversation about, is so crucial and so important because we want to make sure that there's a baseline. It makes sure that every company understands what is expected of them. That's what companies want, is consistency, is knowing what they have to do. That's what these standards do, and make sure that auditors know exactly what it is that they need to be looking for and doing as they're doing this process. So look, I think that these standards are amazing. I think these standards are crucial. They both make business sense and common sense. And I really thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to join us for this conversation. So with that, let me pass this on to Mahalet. Mahalet?
Thank you so much, Roy. You've heard now from Ty how this came together. You've heard what is so important about this work, the imperative from Roy. And now we're going to pull up our slides and share with you all a little more background about this initiative, and then dive into the details of the standards. So first, After hearing the imperative and how this all started, we want to go next to the goal of the Civil Rights Standards. As you heard, there hasn't been consistency in audits. And so the goal of these standards is really to ensure consistency and credibility in civil rights audits that are undertaken by US companies relating to their work in the US. And on the next slide, we have the technical definition of what a civil rights audit is. It's an independent, objective assessment of a company's efforts to promote civil rights and to mitigate bias and discrimination risks related to the company's policies and practices. It is meant to be comprehensive, and it is meant to be independent and objective. And today, as you hear about all the standards, you'll see exactly how we define that and the guidance and implementation instructions that we provide companies around this. Let's go to the next slide and dive a little bit into what a civil rights audit is not. It isn't a legal compliance assessment. It also is not a formal investigation into specific allegations of discrimination. And it isn't limited to just a workplace review or a DEI program, efficacy review, or culture review. It is much more than that. As you heard from Roy, it relates to all aspects of the business and all teams and all functions. So with that in mind, I'll share a little bit now about the team behind this effort, and then we'll turn into diving into the standards. So on the next slide is a little bit about PolicyLink and the CapEQ teams. As you heard about CapEQ from Ty, I also want to share that CapEQ has really incubated this work from the very beginning, not just bringing the standards to market, but also designing and executing a pilot training program for aspiring auditors. And CapEQ is going to continue to partner with PolicyLink and supporting us in building the ecosystem of qualified independent auditors that are well-versed in these standards. PolicyLink is very excited and grateful to be serving as the secretariat for these standards going forward. And that means that we're going to be managing implementation strategy, administrative matters, and also supporting the Civil Rights Audit Standards Committee. And on the next slide, to round out the team, we share more about the Civil Rights Audit Standards Committee, which is the group of professionals, including business executives, investors, worker advocates, and civil rights experts, really a diverse group of 11 professionals that have spent the past 12 months or so developing these standards. And you see everybody's names on the right there. And note that company names are only listed for identification purposes. The committee members serve in their personal capacity. And we would not have reached this milestone without the support and leadership of Farhana Kara, who is the lead drafter of these standards and who has served and will continue to serve as an advisor to the committee. Now, before we dive into the standards, I also want to share a very important connection that these standards have with another initiative at PolicyLink. For those of you who know PolicyLink, you likely know that we released performance standards for businesses in May, just a few months ago. And these performance standards are really about the KPIs for equity across inclusion and social responsibility across corporate governance, hiring practices, building a diverse workforce, products and services, the value chain, and the like. And it may be that our slides are caught up here, but we'll catch up on that soon. But the key connection is that these civil rights audit standards are integrated in those business standards that we have recently released. And they're integrated specifically in a standard focused on ensuring the company has the internal infrastructure for the long-term success and advancing practices that are equitable and inclusive and socially responsible for all people. And so wherever business leaders may be coming to this work, you can start in adopting the business standards we released by conducting a civil rights audit in line with these standards. Or if you start with a civil rights audit, you can then use the business standards we released as really a roadmap of what comes next and how to determine how you can fill the gaps that an audit may have identified in practices. And now with that, let's see if the slides might be able to be advanced. And I think we will be ready to turn over. Oh, there we go. Can we go back one just to flash that slide. The main point here is these business standards and the civil rights audit standards, they go hand in hand. They take the guesswork out of conducting a robust gap analysis and what to aim for in addressing identified gaps. There's no light between the two. And now I'm very excited to turn it over to Farhana Kara, lead drafter of the standards, for an overview and deep dive into this work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mahalet. Next slide, please. Wonderful. Well, I am just delighted to be with you all here today. Today is a very exciting day as I join with my colleagues in introducing the first ever Civil Rights Audit Standards. And I am going to be walking you through essentially a deep dive into those standards, along with my colleagues, Renee Manley, Tejal Patel, and Evan Feeney. And what we're going to do is we're going to essentially show you how these standards are really a roadmap for what a civil rights audit is and how to conduct a civil rights audit. And what we thought we would do is essentially walk you standard by describing really a bit about what the challenge was that was being experienced by the different stakeholders in the ecosystem. And how the standard addresses that particular issue. So without further ado, I'm going to move to the first standard. Next slide. And I'm going to ask my colleague Renee to join me on screen. Renee, could you tell us a little bit about the challenge that was being encountered with scope?
Absolutely, Farhana. And I just want to thank the whole team and everybody who's online viewing the webinar. This is an exciting day for those of us who've been working on this for the last year. So I just want to remind folks that the entire process of a civil rights or racial equity audit from an investor vantage point is to mitigate risk, right? Investors file these proposals or engage with companies because they want to mitigate the risk or understand the risk associated with the company's civil rights or racial justice or racial equity practices and programs. And so a limited scope audit really does not provide that kind of holistic overview that gives investors and other stakeholders a total overview and a holistic vantage point of how the company is mitigating risk or what risk exists. And so it's really important that the scope of the audit is more comprehensive, that it's not limited to, just their DE&I practices or one segment of the business enterprise, that it really is holistic. And I think that, provides a strategic kind of overview and helps investors understand how this is tied to the long-term sustainability of the business enterprise, because really that's what investors are looking for. So, and I just would say also that when companies do refuse to look at it from a more comprehensive vantage point, it may set off concerns from investors and other stakeholders that the company may have something to hide, or maybe there's some other challenges that are not as transparent, and that could be problematic for the company as well.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Renee. And the way that the standard addresses the challenge that Renee just set out is in two essential ways. First, by really calling for an examination of the key areas of the business, including its policies, its practices, its products, its services, the workforce, and community impact, as well as examining the steps taken to prevent or reduce bias and discrimination risks, and steps taken to advance equity, inclusion, and equal opportunities for all. And next slide, please. The second challenge, Renee.
Yes, thank you. So qualified independent auditors are essential to the entire process and really to the integrity of the outcome of the final report. An audit that does not have someone that is qualified and independent, and we say both of those things are really important, right? Is really a problem and can only help having someone who is independent and qualified understand the risk and provide the type of advice and overview, again, that addresses the issues of sustainability and mitigates the risks that investors may be concerned about. And, we believe that a company that would not want to have an independent or qualified auditor, it may signal that investor concerns about the company's risk around issues of racial and civil rights may have some validity and may, justify, both those investors and other external stakeholders having a closer look at the company and, engaging them in a different way. And so it's just really important that the independence and qualified auditor standard is adhered to in this process.
Thank you, Renee. And what the committee did here with this standard in seeking, number one, really wanting to impress upon that what the committee is seeking is independence, is the committee actually looked to the American Bar Association model rules of professional conduct. And even though auditors do not need to be lawyers, and I want to underscore that, auditors do not need to be lawyers, but we did look to the ABA model rules, and we looked specifically to the duty of candor, and took inspiration from that. And so this standard specifies that the auditor should exercise independent professional judgment and renders candid advice. It also specifies that the auditor does not have an actual conflict of interest, nor the appearance of a conflict of interest. And then with respect to the qualifications, that the auditor or the firm should have deep expertise in a commitment to civil rights and racial justice. And finally, that this standard requires that the auditor certify their independence as well as their qualifications in writing to the company and in the audit report. Next slide. Renee? Ooh.
Yes, this one is very close to my heart. The insufficient or lack of stakeholder engagement in the audit process. And we, in my former role, where the place where I was working was a lead filer on some shareholder proposals, and in my conversation with other investors, we've had instances where the target company did not contact the primary stakeholder, which would be the investor that filed the proposal, like literally did not have any communication. And so that clearly is not a best practice, and would signal, that there is some problem or lack of commitment, even if they're engaging, air quotes, in a civil rights audit process. I think the other thing that we see on the extreme is that the company's limited stakeholder, insufficient stakeholder engagement would mean that they are only talking to stakeholders where maybe they have a prior relationship. So those folks who may have been the recipients of their charitable giving or their philanthropic initiatives. And, and we're not saying that those people should not be included, but we're saying is that it should really have a list of more comprehensive stakeholder engagement. And that's working with the proponent or the advocate to help identify, stakeholders, which it could include employees, could include other investors, other kind of key stakeholders, including labor organizations and others. Again, we're trying to mitigate risk and look at the long-term sustainability of this company in regards to this specific issue. And you cannot do that in a holistic manner without engaging key stakeholders and making sure that stakeholder engagement is robust.
And I would also add that the committee found that in those audits and audit processes where the companies did engage those key stakeholders, those audit processes were much more credible, much more comprehensive. And that's what informed this standard, where we say a party that in good faith has requested the audit, the company and the party should make best efforts to reach mutual agreement on the scope of the audit, the timeline for the audit, and the selection of the auditor. And the auditor should meet with the party at the beginning of the audit and before recommendations are finalized at a minimum. And in any event, regardless of whether there is a party who had requested the audit or not, in that situation, the auditor should be engaging with key internal and external stakeholders during the audit process. Thank you so much, Renee.
Thank you.
Moving now to the next challenge, and I'm going to invite my colleague Tejal to join me. Tejal, could you share a bit about this challenge?
Sure. And I just want to say thank you to CapEQ, PolicyLink, and Farhana for all the work that they've put into this. I think the guidance provided by these standards is really something that's needed. It's something that companies and other investors have been asking for. So I'm just really excited to see this all come to fruition. So standard 4, just overall, the standards in general are really meant to encompass the fundamental elements of what a robust audit process and report can look like. When it comes to access to information, the audit is only going to be as good as the information it's based on, right? So lack of access to the right information or people who can provide that information can limit the scope of the audit. It can make it less comprehensive than what the company may have intended it to be. And making sure that auditors are able to leverage external sources in their determinations is equally important. Because there's going to be some topical areas in many instances that may not be within the area of expertise of the lead auditor, something that they're familiar with, like algorithmic bias, for example. The other reason why access to information is really important is it reflects the level of commitment by management to the audit process. So one of the things that investors like ourselves did in developing civil rights audit proposals was we talked to civil rights auditors. And they indicated to us that allowing access to information was incredibly important to the robustness of the audit. And it indicated a level of trust and collaboration by management. And we found that this buy-in by management typically makes for a better process and stronger recommendations that hopefully can be leveraged by the company.
Great. Thank you, Tejal. And so therefore, we do have a standard about that underscores the importance of access to information. And really the key elements of this are ensuring that the company is cooperating with the auditor and providing that access to individuals or to data, as well as underscoring that the auditor should be looking for that information wherever the auditor needs to get it, whether it's from inside the company or sometimes even from outside the company, even from outside experts. Next slide. Tejal?
Yeah, so this standard is really getting to the importance of rigor and objectivity. Just as an example, one of the things that we've seen sort of in prior reports has been a lack of disclosure, public disclosure at least, surrounding stakeholders that were consulted. So an auditor would simply say, we met with a wide variety of stakeholders, but there was no indication as to what these groups' roles were, who these groups were, if there was any prior relationships with those stakeholders or how they were selected. And all of these questions play into the depth of analysis by the auditor and goes to how comprehensive the auditor was in developing their recommendations. I think the rigor and objectivity element also goes part and parcel to standard 3 that Renee talked about. Making sure you have independent civil rights auditors conducting these audits. In the past, we've seen, internal departments at companies conducting these types of audits. We've seen the utilization of financial auditors who happen to also be the company's external financial auditor conducting these audits. And in those instances, we've found that the audit really lacked the rigor and the trust but verify approach that the standards are asking for. And in part, it was because of these conflicts of interest that are sort of present. And so this standard, hopefully it addresses these issues because it sets expectations of how an auditor can effectuate their objectivity and thoroughness in their process.
Thank you so much, Tejal. And this standard, kind of what Tejal says, this standard really interacts with standard 2. Standard 2 is about who the auditor is or the auditing team is. And this is about what that process looks like and that end product. And we're talking about that need for objectivity. And that's what the standard is really about, really emphasizing that that process and the product needs to be, we're looking for that objectivity, the candor, the diligence. By the way, this also calls for an attestation in the report from the auditor that the audit has been conducted consistent with these standards as well. Next slide. Tejal?
Sure. No company wants to be seen as whitewashing a civil rights audit. That doesn't really benefit the company's reputation nor its goodwill among consumers and buyers. And so transparency is a critical element to communicating to company stakeholders that the company has received these recommendations and that they have a roadmap really on what is working and what could be improved upon. And the public report also allows for follow-up by stakeholders on certain issues as potential points of engagement to hopefully prevent these issues from kind of becoming bigger in the future. The standard also addresses something we've encountered in the past. So we've had instances, for example, where there were no recommendations issued. There's no commitment to follow up on recommendations. There's no indication of why an auditor didn't address a specific topic. And so the transparency standard is intended to address these concerns so there's consistency on the disclosure that's provided. But I think it also allows for some degree of tailoring the reports to each company, which is something Roy mentioned earlier. And just finally, from an investor perspective, which is the one that we take, U.S. securities law is based on transparency, making sure that investors have a full picture of the company to make investment decisions. And these reports really are important to help provide investors with material and information on the risks that companies may face and how the company is addressing those risks.
Thank you, Tejal. Tejal really articulated, I think, very clearly and succinctly the importance of transparency and why we need more consistency in these audit reports in the fact of disclosing them as well as in their content. And that's what the standard does, and very clearly laying out a requirement that the company disclose the report, starting with the fact that it's actually conducting an audit, the name of the auditor and the audit timeline, and that it disclose that report in a publicly easily accessible way on its website, and then the actual spelling out some of the key contents of what's expected to be in that report. So thank you so much, Tejal.
Thanks, Verona.
Moving to the next challenge, and I'm going to invite my colleague, Evan, to join me. Evan.
Thank you, Farhana. So one of the places that we consistently saw and heard about variance in the conducting of audits was around how long should it take an auditor to complete an audit? Should it be 6 months, a year, a multi-year project? We believe it should take a year because an audit is not about indexing and solving every problem at a company. An audit is about building long-term processes and making structural changes that lead to ongoing improvements in decision-making across a company, leading to better civil rights and racial justice outcomes. Even for the largest Fortune 500 companies, a year is plenty of time to understand the internal drivers of the biggest harms and to begin to scope out a clear plan to move that forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Evan. And so we basically very simply saying the standard, as Evan just said, that we think a 1 year or within one year is a reasonable time frame, unless there's the scope of the audit or availability of resources necessitate more time. And of course, there's some exceptional circumstances that may require more time, in which case the auditor and the company should come to some mutual agreement about that. Next slide.
Yeah, lack of clarity about the appropriate frequency of audits. Similar to what I said about Standard 7, the goal of an audit is system and process changes. So when an audit leads to long-term change in a company, frequent successive audits should not be necessary. For example, Airbnb's 2016 audit leading to their ongoing Project Lighthouse, which is an embedding of a new team inside their product department to collaborate with civil rights groups and studying discriminatory outcomes on the platform and testing innovative solutions to resolve them. When audits lead to that type of system and process change of examining harms and scoping out how does a company fix them, it eliminates the need for successive audits. So a truly high quality audit is going to put standards and processes into place that really reduce the need for audits every few years.
Thanks so much, Evan. And here, the committee basically said, hey, it's difficult, as Evan kind of said, it's difficult to say, a company should be doing an audit and just pick a particular time frame and say all companies should just fit this one time frame. It's really going to vary. So what the committee said is, look, what we do know is that civil rights audits should be a regular corporate practice. And so these should be conducted on a regular basis. And in determining what that cadence should be, the company should consider these three factors: what that scope of that preceding audit was, the nature of those recommendations, and what the status is of the company's progress in implementing those recommendations. And Evan just gave you a great example. But there are some circumstances where, for example, a company may be required to conduct a more frequent audit. If, for example, the auditor actually specifically recommended a more frequent audit, maybe there's a certain severity of problems that justify a more frequent audit. Or maybe there's a particular significant issue arises that was not identified during the prior audit that would justify an audit taking place sooner. So those are just some reasons that might need to be considered. Next slide.
And then the last challenge that we identified was the need to increase board engagement for more impactful audits. Having engaged with companies doing audits across almost the last decade, one of the key drivers of whether or not an audit led to long-term change at a company was how much board and executive level engagement there was throughout the process. Board oversight and accountability ensures resource and decision-making alignment throughout the company. We've too often seen audits default to ownership by a VP of DEI or head of HR or other similar position that doesn't have oversight or insight into other verticals throughout a company, and that ultimately reduces the comprehensive nature of the audit down to something more narrowly focused on hiring and retention and employment rather than policy, products, philanthropic giving. A great example from a recent audit of just how impactful board oversight and accountability can be is State Street's recent audit, where they've begun implementing KPIs and other performance-based goals across the company, and compliance on those is being reported directly to the board, which is helping to ensure a holistic company-wide effort to close the gap on the recommendations made by their audit team.
Thanks, Evan. And so just building on what Evan just said, this standard essentially builds on that and says, look, we think the board of directors needs to have a role. It should have an oversight role. It could be directly, or it could be by designating a committee. We're not saying the board should be involved in the day-to-day of managing the audit. That's appropriate for the executive team, but the board should have that oversight role. And then another piece of the standard is that we also think the company should retain an auditor to evaluate after the audit is completed to determine whether the company has actually successfully implemented the recommendations from the audit. So that completes the 9 standards. And next slide, please. Thank you. So these are the 9 standards that my colleagues and I have just walked through with you. And if companies follow these standards, they can be sure that they've not only likely have just completed a very comprehensive and credible civil rights audit, but they have probably done a rigorous review of their bias and discrimination risks and have set their companies up well in terms of identifying those potential risks and avoided any business risks for their companies. I also just want to point out before I turn it over to my colleague to lead a Q&A session is that the civil rights standards that hopefully you will have a chance to review. I think my colleague is going to put a link to the actual standards so you get a chance to review them. Each standard that we've just walked through has 2 sections accompanying them. They're each accompanied by an explanation and then an implementation section. So you get some context about the background or an explanation for that standard, and then guidance about whether or how to actually implement that particular standard. And so we hope that these standards are easy to understand, easy to implement. But if you do have any questions, we're going to give you some email for where we can field your further questions if we don't get to them during the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor back over to my colleague, Ty.
Thank you, Farhana, and thanks to all the committee members. We're getting a Q&A coming in hot, so I am going to make sure we have a chance to answer everyone's questions. Why don't we start off with, because we're hearing civil rights audits, and there's been several questions related to how are civil rights audits aligned with, not aligned with, connected to DEI? So I am going to turn over to Mahalet to answer that question.
Sure. Thank you, Ty, and really welcome other team members to chime in after me if there's anything I missed. But there really is no light between these two. DEI is meant to ensure that historically underrepresented and excluded groups have fair opportunities for great jobs, fair opportunities to advance in their jobs and the like. And that is grounded in principles in our civil rights laws of non-discrimination and treating people fairly. So there really isn't light between these two. And what is really distinct about these standards is that they focus on a comprehensive look across the organization, whereas conventionally, DEI can be thought of it's just a workplace thing, it's just a culture review, but really advancing DEI is part and parcel of doing civil rights audits on a periodic basis and thinking across the whole spectrum of impacts that a business has, all the way through to corporate political activity, for example, and the like. So that's how they connect. It's really a circle, not a Venn diagram, and hope folks can see more of how that comes through in the standards.
Thank you, Mahalet. So connected to that question, and I think you answered it, but I'll just have Farhana give a little bit of context as well. There was a question, so can you explain again how this is not a workplace audit? And I think that Farhana giving just a little bit more double click on what Mahalet said might help with that one too.
Yeah, because this goes, I would say civil rights audit goes way beyond DEI, because DEI is typically just referring to those workforce related issues. A civil rights audit's intent is to look very broadly at all of the components of the company. So it might involve a company's product or service, like for example, the Facebook audits. We're very focused on the platform itself, and it's, what was happening with the content basically of Facebook itself. Or the community impact, a company's political advocacy, its philanthropic activities. So it's intended to look across the board, not just at those workforce related issues. But having said that, just to tag on to what Mahalet was saying, in this environment where there is this kind of this anti-DEI kind of pushback, and I know many corporate leaders are dealing with these issues, I think the civil rights audit is a wonderful tool to be able to really go kind of beyond that surface, where it's easy to frankly just move those letters or those words around and say, okay, you don't like DEI, we're going to call it IED, or we're going to take the E out and call it IND, and there, are you happy now? But that's not addressing the real issues, right? Like a civil rights audit will actually allow corporate leaders to actually look at, take that deep dive, allow you to look at the real underlying issues, and really set your company up for success long term. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Farhana. I saw lots of head nods from the committee members. So if anyone wants to chime in there, feel free. Otherwise, I will move on to the next question.
I will chime in just briefly, Ty. What Farhana and Mahaled said is absolutely accurate. But I just want to add that this is about mitigating risk and long-term sustainability, right? And so when you look at the demographics and you look at where the United States is headed, we already have the fact that California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, is not majority white, it's majority people of color. So when you look at the long-term sustainability of companies addressing both their, recruiting and, how they're going to attract talent, how their products, services, and business practices, they really have to take into consideration these issues of civil rights. And if they do not, as an investor, I would be questioning how are they setting their company up for long-term sustainability and success. And so really, this is about looking at every aspect of the business, helping the company focus on this new normal in a way that, creates a win-win for everybody, quite frankly.
Thank you, Renee. I feel like that question opened up people's boldness. So someone just came straight out and said, well, how do civil rights audits, how are they impacted by the Supreme Court decision? And how will we be able to continue to do this work in light of that? Farhana, maybe I turn it over to you since you're our resident attorney. But Mahaled is as well, actually. So you guys can duke it out on who's going to answer. But let's start with you.
So in a direct sense, it doesn't affect a company's ability to conduct an audit because the Supreme Court, I'm assuming they're referring to the Supreme Court decision from last summer, which dealt with in higher ed. And again, like what I said, that I think this is a wonderful tool. You're calling in an independent civil rights expert from outside the company to come in, look under the hood, so to speak, and do that review of the different aspects of your company, identify any potential bias or discrimination risks in the company, talk to folks in your company, collect the data, talk to your important stakeholders, and make those recommendations, identify those gaps, make recommendations for improvements, and set your company up for, to be in a potentially stronger place. So I think it's a win-win in this environment, frankly, and is the smart thing to do in this environment. And especially with this kind of with all these kinds of attacks and folks coming from various corners who want to attack your company with all sorts of strange arguments, I will say.
I'll just chime in quickly to just couldn't emphasize that more. Think of this tool, think of civil rights audits as a prophylactic, right? The Supreme Court decision had a huge impact on businesses in that it has resulted in a chilling effect where businesses are not quite sure what they can and cannot do for the betterment of their own performance and their workers and for, promoting positive impacts on communities and society overall. And that's very unfortunate. And we hope that this tool can support leaders in really accessing something that can guide them through in a nonpartisan way, really focused on ensuring equal opportunities for everybody, to make sure that you are adhering to our civil rights laws and you are really embedding in the business principles of non-discrimination. That applies to everybody. And there should be no fear about protecting your workers, protecting the long-term performance of your business. It's essential, and it's time to not be afraid and to use the tools that are out there for businesses and other organizations.
Mahaled, I'm going to stick with you because there's a lot of enthusiasm about, oh my gosh, this sounds amazing. How can I become a civil rights auditor? And would love to hear from you on that and training and things like that.
Awesome. So we'll get into it just in our wrap up as well. But those are that's one of the big things we're doing next. We do want to build in partnership with CapEQ, the ecosystem of civil rights auditors. And so we're going to be investing in conducting more civil rights audit trainings and the like in the future. We'll at least have a couple every year. And we'll be building out a directory of civil rights auditors that are well-versed in these standards in particular. And so more to come on that. If you're interested in it, we'll share how you can express your interest in that as we wrap up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mahalet. There's a question. Okay, so we talked a lot about businesses as it relates to civil rights audits, but several folks are from the public sector and want to know if it can be applied to school districts or other public serving offices. Would love to hear from you, Farhana, on that.
Yeah, even though the standards were built for companies, I think the principles do apply to public agencies and could be easily applied in that regard. So, and I do welcome if there are public agencies that do take these standards and utilize them. I will be curious to hear their feedback and thoughts on that. But yeah, I think our interest here was in directing this to companies because that's where there was a lot of activity and where we were seeing the real need to have some consistency and the need for where we were really hearing that there needed to be some essentially some rules of the road and some guardrails of around, okay, wait, hold on a second. What exactly is an audit? And how should these be conducted? And so that's why these standards are very focused on companies.
Wonderful. There's a question about why did you call them civil rights audits versus DEI audits? And I'm smiling because that was a back and forth when we were doing the design. Farhana, why don't we stay with you on that one?
Yeah, and I think, again, this gets to that scope question that the civil rights audits are much broader than workplace. So these are not workplace reviews, workplace audits. These are not DEI. These are much, much broader. These go to all components of a company. Their operations, their products, their services. This might even include some of their, international related if they have activities. These are global companies in nature. So this goes way beyond just the workforce related issues. And that's why calling them DEI audits would not be appropriate. Having said that, the DEI components, though, are certainly included in this. So I want to make that clear too. That aspect is certainly included, but it goes way beyond that.
Thank you, Farhana. I'm going to leave the last question and the last word to Mahalet, which is basically civil rights audit standards make sure you have a credible audit, but what happens next?
Great question. It touches a little bit on what we shared before around the business standards that PolicyLink together with its partners, FSG and Just Capital, released back in May. But you conduct a business civil rights audit in line with these standards. What you end with is an audit report. And in getting to that audit report, you can look to our business standards for a roadmap on what goals to aim for in the long term. And know that there's no light between these two tools. And so think about the civil rights audit as really setting up the company. And Evan, you said this really beautifully, for long-term success, addressing the structures and systems and practices within the company. And so what comes next is continuing to make progress. It isn't a check the box exercise. It's really an opportunity to strengthen practices and ensure that the business is set up for the long term to serve all of its stakeholders. Thank you, Ty.
Thank you, Mahalet. We ran out of time for questions, but don't worry. As we said in the beginning, we captured all the ones that were in the chat. We're going to do our best to address them in FAQs. I want to thank all of the folks who presented today and turn over to Mahalet to give us closing and next steps.
Thank you, Ty, and thank you to all the committee members who joined in sharing their direct experiences that really informed what these standards should be and how they can help businesses for the long term. As we bring up the last slide, we really just want to talk through what comes next in connection with these standards. And so what you see here is a sketch of the next few years. where we are now. We've just released the standards. For folks to know as well, we also ran an inaugural Civil Rights Auditor training program. CapEQ led that. And it has concluded successfully, and we're going to begin the next phase of that training program this fall. As I mentioned, we'll be building a directory of qualified civil rights auditors as well, and continuing to conduct road shows and doing the ongoing socialization of these standards. So if anyone is interested in having a closed-door session with their organization or with coalitions that you're part of, please reach out to us. We'd be excited to do that. In 2025, we're going to be building and launching a digital platform for those business standards that I mentioned, and it will be integrating the Civil Rights Audit Standards. As I mentioned, that is a wonderful place to start in building a long-term plan for success. We'll expand our auditor trainings, and we'll also be exploring an auditor certification and maybe even an RFP clearinghouse, so that really we can play a matchmaking role between organizations that want to conduct audits and civil rights auditors that are well versed in these standards in order to do those audits successfully. And we'll also release additional tools for auditors, for example, an audit report template that one can follow, knowing that what you ultimately produce will track what's in the standards. And of course, the Civil Rights Audit Committee will be annually reviewing the standards to ensure that they are meeting their intended goals of greater credibility and consistency in the conduct of civil rights audits. And then long-term, a lot more of that, and of course, building additional partnerships for those that are excited to work with us as we build out this work, and especially build out the ecosystem of civil rights auditors as well. And let's go to the last slide. Just want to share some contact information and ways to reach out and what's coming up. There's the link to the home for the Civil Rights Audit Standards. Stay tuned for training programs and getting onto the directory of auditors. And if you're interested in any of those opportunities, please email us at civilrightsstandards@policylink.org. And again, thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thank you to CapEQ for your partnership, as always, for Hannah for being the lead drafter of these incredible standards. We would not have gotten here without you and the entire committee. And looking forward to hearing from folks, especially the application of the standards and how it's going. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.